Jump into electrical systems test 9. This is about gauges and warning devices and stuff. And what a bimetallic gauge is, it says the first one's in a bimetallic gauge, needle movement indicates varying amounts of current going to the circuit. What you basically have in a bimetallic gauge is you've got a little strip of metal that's comprised of two pieces of metal that are married to one another, and they expand and contract at different rates. That's like bimetal means it's two pieces of metal. They got a little heating wire wrapped around them. That little heating wire's got insulation on it. And the more current you put into that heating wire, the more that bimetallic strip changes shape, and it's driving a needle. That's the old kind of gauges that we used to have a long time ago. I got one over there under one of them boards like that. And what happened on those, when you switched off the car, they would go back to zero. The problem with those is, if you hooked power and ground directly up to them, and you left it hooked up to them, it would burn up that little wire and you destroy the gauge.
Yeah, good question. Do they used to be in the back of speedometers?
What?
The thing on speedometers, yeah. The
No.
thing on the gauge, the speedometer gauge on the back. Did they used to have something like that on the back?
No, what they did have, the speedometer, basically what the speedometer had, the older speedometers, the cable was spinning a drum, and that drum had a magnet. In other words, right in the center of that drum was a little hole, and there was a little magnet that was hooked to the needle. They had a little spiral spring that held it down there.
Okay.
And all that. But anyway, what we got right here is but every time as that cable spun faster, it would actually cause that little magnet inside that drum to try to follow that spinning, and the faster it spun, the more that needle would move against that spring.
That wasn't current though.
That wasn't current, not in those days. That was basically mechanically done. And then there were some little gears and stuff in there that were connected to the odometer and all that kind of stuff. Incidentally, if somebody brings you a vehicle and the odometer works but the speedometer don't, what's that telling you?
Speedo cable's unhooked?
No, the odometer is driven by the speedo cable too.
Really?
Or if they come to you and they tell the speedometer works but the odometer don't, what's that telling you?
That's something in between. Yeah.
Since they're both driven by the same cable, it's got to be in that head.
Yeah.
Common sense. Now, most of the speedometers nowadays, just about all of them that I know about, are electronic. They're driven electronically. They hadn't had a speedometer cable or nothing for years. On the old Volkswagen Bugs, like Joe is so fond of, the speedometer cable went out to the bearing cap.
Yep.
It went out to the bearing cap on the left front wheel. And there was a little square hole in it, and the end of that cable was square, and you stick it out through that hole and had a hole all the way through that spindle, and it would actually spin that, drive the speedometer that way. And the gas gauge had a cable going for the float up to the little gas gauge needle. It was a crazy thing how they did that. In a bimetallic gauge, the bimetal strip moves the needle by way of a magnetic field. That is absolutely false. The first one's true. That's false. An instrument voltage regulator delivers regulated voltage to the gauge circuit. Now, these are old questions, granted, but I mean questions about old systems. The instrument voltage regulator would put a little pulsing 5-volt signal. If you got bimetal gauges and you go to that sending unit where you unplug it from the center and you hook your test light to it, you ought to see a blinking signal. Now, that's the old kind, the old bimetallic, and we're talking, 60s, real early 70s. Ford had bimetallic gauges until '86 on most of their vehicles, and then they went in '87 everything started to change. They started using the magnetic gauges, but the little instrument voltage regulator was a little thing on the back of the cluster that had little contacts on it that looked like a 9-volt battery, but they were farther apart. And what they would do whenever you'd pop it on there, that little thing was like a turn signal flasher, almost had a little bimetal strip in it that would open and close as it heated up and cooled off. The magnetic gauge uses balancing coils and magnetic fields to move the indicator. You know how that works?
Sure.
Right? In the magnetic gauge, the armature rotates in response to the magnetic action. What about that?
True.
That's number 5. That's true too. All right. And have you ever noticed, like on some of those old magnetic gauge cars, wherever the gauge was when you switched off the car is where it stayed. When you switch off the car, it didn't go to empty like we were supposed to, But on the newer ones, they have like that instrument cluster you see up there, there's a microprocessor in it. When you turn on the instrument, when you turn on the key, all of the needles will sweep all the way through and then go back. You notice they do that? You notice how they do that? They go all the way through and then they come all the way back and all that. Let's see, the sending units are primarily used in system design of warning of dangerously high temperatures. Well, not really, no, not really, no. They're not primarily used in that, although there are, some.
That gas sending you.
Yeah, there's other sending units too that, senders are using anytime you need to monitor speed, position, whatever, that kind of stuff. The instrument voltage regulator maintains an average of 10 volts of current flow to the gauge circuit. That's false, actually, it's not that much. Yeah. Thermistor varies its resistance in relation to current surges. That's false. What does it vary?
Temperature.
Temperature is temp because therm. The instrument voltage regulator is mounted either in or near the alternator. That's wrong. It's on the back of the instrument cluster. I said it a few minutes ago. If you got that wrong, slap yourself. Okay, when replacing an instrument voltage regulator or a gauge unit, the technician should always disconnect the negative battery cable first. Is that true? Okay, the negative battery cable. Why not the positive one?
Because the negative's the one that's grounded in.
All the electrons over in there, in the negative side, and then they're both of them connected, then they're moving. It keeps them,
Just like you see the look on his
if you
face,
move the
just
positive one around, you could discharge, you can have a electrical discharge.
Well, basically, if you just take the positive one off, the whole rest of the car is grounded.
Yeah.
If you drop a wrench and it touches the fender and it can touch the positive cable, you're still going to short out.
That's what
If you take the negative one off, you ain't going to short out on nothing because of the body of the car's not grounded. And she said that, sort of, when she was talking about
It's
that.
the same.
And so you struggled with that thing under the dash for how long? For what reason? Why was it so hard for you this morning? You found an easier way to do it.
I found an easier way to do it. There was very little space.
So the first, to start with, she was just finding that thing tooth and nail, and then she came up with a better way to do it. And what was a better way to do it?
Pull the glove out.
I will tell you one of the things. Listen to this, guys. Words to the wise. Sometimes when you're working on something and you're too close to it, you just need to back off and think about it a different way. Now, one time I saw this kid that was down there watching some helicopter mechanics that we had that company I worked for had a bunch of helicopters. And he had to go down there and change the oil on a little Kubota mower that was down there at the heliport, and so he was changing oil on that mower and he was watching these helicopter mechanics. They was having a terrible time getting that skid back on that helicopter. They couldn't get the holes to line up. And he was watching them from a distance over there. And he's just an oil changer. But he says, "Hey guys, you need some help getting that skid back on that helicopter?" And they sort of laughed at him. They went over there and they said, "Yeah," because they've been fighting with it a little bit. They were too close to it. He said, "Watch this." And he picked up one end of the skid and he put a bolt through it. And when he raised it up, all the rest of the holes lined up. Because they were doing it wrong, But anyway, the thing about it is sometimes it takes a new fresh set of eyes or a fresh way of looking at it. Or sometimes if you just go to lunch and you come back, it'll fall right in place. That's what happens too. Okay. Let's see. But fuel gauge is either bimetallic or magnetic. Not always. If you want to get that right, say true. But nowadays they're not. They're going to be. Some of them are going to be electronically driven within the cluster. You know what I mean? And just remember that because a lot of the times your instrument cluster is a computer. You can actually go in there and talk to it with your scan tool. You can make things happen if you got a two-way talker, two-way scan tool. Seatbelt warning devices are time delayed.
No. How are they time related?
Well, the older ones were, but nowadays they're different.
So,
Here's another little story. Let's say that somebody hands you this, and this is a gauge-related question. Somebody hands you this ticket on this little Ranger, and they say, when we drive and we hit about 30 miles an hour, the speedometer reads normal, so we hit about 30 miles an hour, and then it drops to zero. Boom.
wheel speed sensor. Right?
No. On this particular one, there's a little module that whenever you hit 30 miles an hour and you hadn't buckled a seatbelt, it starts that little seatbelt thing going ding, 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 ding. Well, it was shorted internally, and it's reading vehicle speed. And so whenever it hit 30 miles an hour, and it went to go ding, 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 it was actually shorting out the speed signal on the speedometer. It's a little module under the seat. You never would have thought of that. You know what I mean? I actually saw one time that would hit about 10 or 15 miles an hour and go to zero, and it was because the fuse panel had was screwed up and internally shorted. And but anyway, a problem in a sending unit could cause a single gauge to malfunction. That's true.
So was 12 true or false? True.
12 is, if you want to get it right according to the answer key, when Katie reads it, she's going to look at that and she's going to see true. But sometimes I have to put a caveat together on this for you guys. The instrument voltage regulator is what? Is it a load control device? Is it an insulating device? Is it a type of printed circuit board? Or all of the above?
All the above.
Now, these questions, like I say, these questions came from the University of Missouri curriculum, so like I say, some of them are kind of old. Be aware of that. As a matter of fact, I've got an entire book up here that I got that actually was published by Ford for automotive technicians on liquid crystal gauges. Pretty cool stuff up there if you don't know how things work. I mean, it goes in detail. A potentiometer varies resistance by using what? Come on.
I know that.
An iron bar and a tungsten steel handle.
Well, this is sort of dumb too. These were the old potentiometer. Nowadays they use resistive paint. They use resistive paint now. Now she's gonna look at this, and if you didn't put E, she's gonna mark it wrong. A wrapped coil and a sliding contact. That's more of a rheostat than it is a potentiometer. Potentiometer. What's the difference between a rheostat and a potentiometer? Anybody know?
One got that coil, that,
One of them pulls a load, the other one sends a signal. What's a rheostat? This is a rheostat right here on the headlight switch. Right there, that headlight switch. That rheostat right there, what is it supposed to do? As you turn the knob, what happens to your dash lights? Current's going through this thing. Well, some of your GM cars, they had a little transistor in there. They had a heat sink on it. And when you turn this little potentiometer, that potentiometer would apply more of a ground to the base on that transistor, and it would give it more. If you applied more of a ground to the base, it would let more flow through it. That was a different way of doing that. Just remember the difference between a rheostat and a potentiometer. They're very similar, except usually a potentiometer's got 3 wires hooked to it, and a rheostat's only got 2. A rheostat will have one wire coming from your power and the other one going to your load. And the closer that slider goes to that power, the brighter that signal is going to your load. When replacing the instrument voltage regulator, and I hate these instrument, I'm gonna edit this test. They got too many instrument voltage regulator questions in here. You guys probably won't ever see one. You got to remove what? What do you got to remove?
Battery.
The instrument cluster only. It's only the back of the instrument cluster. The bulb in an automotive warning lamp is made of tinted glass. Is it?
No,
What?
That's a screwed up question, isn't it?
it's not.
Is it made of tinted plastic? Is it mounted behind a colored lens? Is it surrounded with a reflective metal, or is it mounted behind a clear lens? An automotive warning light's the one on the dash, the red ones, the orange ones, all these other ones.
Okay.
It's mounted behind a key piece of colored plastic, and it's just a white light. Now some of your dash warning lamps will have little blue filters on them so that they're not as harsh when you're driving at night. They make a gentle little light that you can see it. The sending unit is usually what?
hold on. We gonna
It's
be,
me.
okay.
17, don't pay attention to that very first letter, choice of our, because that's a screwed up formatted question. A, B, C, and D are down below are the ones you're looking at. What's the sending unit usually nowadays? If it's a warning lamp, if it's driving a warning lamp, what is it usually? How you gonna do a warning lamp, y'all? Come on, you're gonna design me a warning lamp circuit, Quincy. I need a warning lamp that will come on whenever something goes wrong. So what am I gonna do? Hello? You guys thinking clearly this morning?
Oh, you said Quincy, so I was like, oh, no,
Yeah. What about it? What would you do if you wanted a warning lamp to work only when a certain set of conditions was met? Huh?
Don't have to be a.
You should hook it to a transistor.
Okay, that's it. We gotta stop for a while and talk some now. Everybody's playing like a bunch of dodos. Here's your warning lamp right here. Right? Now remember, power comes in from the top, ground from the bottom, right? Okay, so I'm gonna put B plus here. I'm gonna feed all my warning lamps to that same B plus, right? All right, down here on the bottom, what do I need? A ground. So I'm gonna have to design me a switch based on position or temperature or pressure or whatever, right?
The grounding switch? Would that be what that is?
Then that switch is gonna be triggered by something that's gonna ground it, right? Okay, like in my 4x4 low, it's basically gonna have little switches mechanically operating. When I put it 4x4 low, it's gonna ground that thing. Is everybody together now? All right then. All right, make sure you remember that. That's gonna be E. In some vehicles, artificial or synthesized voices warn drivers. See how old these questions are? Warn drivers of a condition that needs attention. Do you know what everybody wanted to do with those right to begin with? Turn that stuff off.
Yep.
Yeah.
Our front end machine over here is fairly new, but it actually has part of the programming in it where you can turn them speakers up, and this guy's voice will talk out of the speakers and tell you what to do. And everybody hates that. They turn it off. I worked with a great big machine that was made by Sun Equipment called an Interrogator, Sun Interrogator, and it had a knob and a speaker on it, and it would talk to you and it would tell you what to do. And every single time I turned around, you know, I was over reaching up there to turn that thing off because I didn't like listening to that guy's voice. Well, these things used to have these things. Your seatbelt is unbuckled. You know, they would tell you something. You know, they would say your seatbelt's unbuckled. Unless it was a German car and it says, you need to buckle up. No, we is making you buckle up, you know, this kind of thing. They didn't say that really. I mean, but basically if they would just have a voice that would tell you, a little voice synthesizer thing. But anyway, that number 19, if you want to get that, that's an A. This test needs to be reworked because these questions are too old. Technician A says an excess of water in a vehicle's fuel tank can cause the fuel gauge to give low readings. Technician B says certain weather conditions may cause the fuel gauge to give incorrect readings. Weather conditions, I started saying. Neither A nor B. What will water in the fuel cause on your Power Stroke diesel, Quincy?
So
What happens if you get water in fuel on your Power Stroke diesel? Light comes on the dash, there's water and fuel on it. And the whole thing's in the horizontal fuel conditioning module. Does everybody know what the horizontal fuel conditioning module is
You said it before.
on that diesel, right? All right. Number 21, technician A says a deformed fuel tank can cause the fuel gauge to operate erratically or stop functioning. Can it or can it not?
Yeah.
If you bend it, yeah. Technician B says a faulty fuel gauge sending unit can cause the fuel gauge to operate erratically or cease functioning completely.
Both.
It can. One time, we had to put a fuel pump in this lady's car, and we put it in there. It was an Explorer, and she drove from Andalusia to Enterprise to where she taught school every day. And so, a couple of days after we put her fuel gauge in, or maybe 3 days, she called me on the phone, and she says, my truck quit right down here by this church, just outside of town. And she said, I had to call for a ride. And she said, the key's under the floor, man. It's sitting down there, and it won't start. It just quit running. So I went down there and turned on the key and heard the fuel pump. That's what you do when you're wanting to see why one won't start. You turn on the key and listen for the fuel pump, right? I mean, who in here didn't know that? Who in here hadn't learned that yet? You turn on the key and you listen to the fuel pump. Heard the fuel pump. Looked at the gas gauge, it's reading 3/4 of a tank. So I unplugged the fuel pump relay. I got my little yellow meter and I put it on amps. And I used my little yellow meter from a jumper to go from the common terminal to the terminal going out to the fuel pump. And I read 1.5 amps. What did that tell me? It's out of gas. No gas in there. It should pull about 8 to 10 amps if it's running. Now the one that, Melissa, that one that you had with that filthy burned up varnish covered fuel pump in it, it was pulling 10 amps, but the pump wasn't spinning. You know, but you couldn't hear the pump either, could you? The pump. Oh, say something else what you could do on that car. Pull that fuel filter off, because we're going to replace that.
Okay.
You got to pull the fuel filter off, and when you get the fuel filter pulled off, I want you to blow backwards through those lines. And get all of that crud out of those lines. We got to get that clean out. I meant to tell you that all morning. I kept forgetting it. But anyway, so what I did, I said it was out of gas. And so I called her and I said, this thing's out of gas. And she said, well, it stayed on 3/4 of a tank ever since y'all worked on it. And I just thought, my goodness, I'm getting really good gas mileage. And she just kept driving it until it quit. And so we had to pull the gas tank back. When the guys put the gas tank back in there, they got the float hung on something, and it was hung up there. What wouldn't move. It wasn't floating on top of the gas. It was hung up on something. So we had to pull it out and put it back in and make sure it was working right and all that kind of thing. But remember that if you hear the fuel pump, you know, it doesn't mean you have pressure. Here's something else. If you're going to check your fuel pressure, a little Schrader, if it's got a Schrader, a lot of them ain't got it now. But if you push that little Schrader and it goes, and air comes out, it's a pretty good bet that it's out of gas. Or if somebody says, when I drove my car, it got hot and it quit, and it would cool off and it would go again. And when I went out and pushed that little thing to see if it had fuel, it just sprayed fuel all over the place. Well, that's telling you right there it's all full of air. Because that thing shouldn't go like a fire hose. It should go and just squirt a little bit on your fingers. it shouldn't spray out of there like a big bunch of air pushing it. I mean, that's a problem right there. You know, if you mash it and a whole bunch of air comes out, you know, that fuel pump's cavitating, and they do that whenever fuel pumps get old, they start cavitating, and they may be running, they may be noisy, but they ain't pumping no fuel. It may be full of fuel. They have low, have cavitating gas. All right, let me see here. Technician A says a faulty printed circuit board can cause the fuel gauge to give inaccurate readings. Technician B says a faulty wiring or component failure within a fuel gauge circuit can cause a fuel gauge to give inaccurate readings. Duh, both those guys are right. Technician A says that if the fuel gauge does not read empty when the fuel tank is known to be empty, the cap on the tank may not be tightened down securely.
That's false.
Even Quincy laughed at that one, didn't he? That was funny, doesn't it? What do you think about Technician A? He's a kind of a buffoon, isn't he? You know, like if somebody says that, my gas gauge ain't working right. Maybe you didn't put your gas cap back on right. Okay, what is this? What is it? All right, the Technician B says if the fuel gauge does not read empty when the fuel tank is known to be empty, a vacuum may have formed within the tank.
True.
That's false. Yeah. That ain't gonna, it doesn't matter if there's a vacuum in there or not, that gauge is gonna lay low. Okay. That's probably George calling me. Let me answer George. Hey. Hey, George. We got the converter and we're putting it on there. It should be really pretty early this afternoon.
Okay. What I'll do is I'll call you after 1 o'clock to make sure it's everything.
You got it, George.
Come over.
All right.
Sound like a winner?
Yeah, sounds good. All right. How much you lack on that? How much you lack on that catalytic, Moody? How much you lack on that catalytic converter?
Gotta take 2 bolts out.
That's all it is. Did Moody tell you about the fancy way that oxygen sensor unhooked on that Nissan?
He showed me.
It had a little gate. You opened it up, and it just, I mean, when you opened it up, it helps you unplug it. And when you put it back in there, you click, and it pulls it back together. It's got 6 wires going to it. Yep. All right. That's pretty sleek. I mean, me and him were both looking at it. I didn't know how that darn thing came off there, but he got horsing around and figured it out. It was good that he did not get really rough with it and bust it. Ain't that right? Ain't that right? Yeah, you're going to do that. All right. Let me ask you this. You're checking the fuel gauge. Ain't working right. You don't think it's right. What you going to do? This is a gauge thing. It's an electrical class. You need to know. Harrison's working at a shop now. He may have to check the fuel gauge.
Yeah, I got a question. Actually, we had one that came in, and the gas gauge and everything like that. It was moving so fast, the it was sitting still.
Mm-hmm. Okay, then what happened? Now, what kind of vehicle was it?
It was a 98 Chevrolet Tahoe.
Now those right there, those tacos, those Chevy Tahoes. That guy said, "I got me one of them Chevrolet Braziers." He said, "You like that thing? I like it better than that taco." You know, but anyway, he says that particular gauge is probably going to be something wrong with the cluster. But what you can do if you want to check it, disconnect the gas tank sending unit, and it should go past full.
That's what we did, and it didn't do nothing.
You know, so that's a gauge problem.
Yeah.
Or, you know, it could be a wiring issue. If you want to, you know, you can actually go all the way up there and check your, well, you can actually, when you get it unhooked back there, the wire that goes to the gauge, you know, you might want to check it and see what you see there. Incidentally, since this is electrical class, Melissa was using one of those stupid little LED test lights that are laying around the shop out here that, you know, one time I bought a gaggle of test lights and they sent me them stupid LED test lights. Everything she touched on that thing lit that LED. And it made her think that there was power everywhere. But I said, let's get you a real test
I
light.
was getting so mad.
And so we got a real test light. It told her the truth. But that little High and Peanuts LED test light, you can just touch it. If there was any voltage, any whisper of anything at all there, it was like using an ohm meter to check circuits on a car with a battery hooked up. That stupid light would light up. That is about the most useless piece of trash for a test light I've ever seen. And they're worried about you messing a computer up with it. I ain't never burnt no computer up with a test light. I don't know what people are talking about. Anyway, never mind. All right, anyway, whoa, that's what I started to say was, you disconnect the gas gauge, your sending unit, and if it goes past full, you short that sending unit wire to ground. If it goes to empty, you know, the wires in the gauge are probably okay. Now, they do have those fuel, those slosh modules on some of them. They keep the gas gauge from jiggling around. And that's basically something that you have to factor in too. But usually, if it has one of those, when you buy a gauge, it'll come with a slosh module. They'll send you the gauge and a slosh module.
Now, Rich, On the bus that I got, the gas gauge on it, it's like left and right. It's not like anything else I've ever dealt with, so I don't even know how much gas is in the tank. It's just
Yeah,
like,
well, a lot of the times on those German cars, it'll say, you know, 1.1, you know, will be full, and it's got, you know, got 0.5 and.
it's got a bunch of numbers. And
Yeah,
it's
that's what I'm saying.
in
That's what they're thinking. Basically, it's kind of like bar. You know, like 14.5 pounds per square is one bar, and they're using, you know, bar bits, you know, 0.5 bar and all that kind of stuff. It's crazy the way they do it, but that's what they do. The BMWs are like that too.
Yeah,
They have
my
a one,
buddy's got a
yeah,
Cougar.
all that. So, okay, yeah, that's a German way of thinking. Okay, then we're gonna do. Where are we at here? Technician A says if the brake warning light comes on when the ignition key is in the on position and the parking brake is released, the brake system may be leaking fluid.
Be that.
I turn it on, the park brake's not on, the red brake light's in my face. Got me? Technician B says if the brake warning light fails to come on when the parking brake is applied and the ignition key's in the on position, the warning light bulb may be burned out. Okay, have you ever noticed that when you turn your key to the start position, some of the lights, well, on these older vehicles, some of the warning lights will come on when you're in the start position because there is a ground wire going to that ignition switch that is delivered to those warning lights when you're in the start position, and that's so that you can tell if the warning lights are burned out. They call that bulb prove out. Now, we got an ignition switch one time from parts store. I don't remember which parts store we got it from, so I'm not pointing fingers at one of the end of the parts stores, but it looked just like the other ignition switch. You know, you mean that white ignition switch over, Melissa? Right there, that square thing. That one right there.
That.
Yeah, that is an ignition switch right there. That's the ignition switch off like a 92 Ford. Fairly easy to change. Well, we got one. It was black instead of white. And it came from a parts store. We put it on there, and the little ground wire that goes in here that feeds this switch, that's supposed to ground those gauges and all that kind of stuff. Something internally shorted out in that aftermarket switch, and as soon as we turned on the key, that little bitty ground wire, not very big, it's a little teeny tiny thing, you know. The smoke went out of that ground wire, and it filled the whole truck up with smoke. A 6-inch piece of wire, if the insulation burns off a 6-inch piece of wire, it'll fill that whole truck up with smoke. It'll make you think the whole wire harness burned under the dash. Scare you to death. Well, anyway, all we had to replace that little 6-inch ground wire, and we got a different ignition switch. The ignition switch was, you know, faulty internally, and so be careful about where these things are made. Are you bench pressing over there? Okay. All right, now then, let me see. Okay, who's right about that? Number 24. Okay. Technician A says if a slow-acting instrument voltage regulator causes rapid vibration of the needle gauge, the regulator should be adjusted. Ain't no good. Technician B says that if all the gauges fail to function, the individual gauge needle should be checked first. Who is right about that? If I see my red brake light on, what does that usually mean to me?
That you're low on fluid.
Usually, that's mostly the time, that's what's wrong. Oh, what else can it mean?
It could mean that you're parking brake.
Leaking somewhere. In other words, if it's leaking fluid somewhere, the little proportioning valve's got a little grounding switch that grounds that bulb out of that. Okay, it's not lunchtime yet. We got some work to do.